President would like to talk to Mr. J. Edgar Hoover.
Thank you.
Hello, Edgar.
Yep.
I don't hear you well. What's the matter? You got this phone tapped?
No. How many shots were fired? Three. Any of them fired at me?
I know there was
All three at the president.
all three at the president, and we have them. The third shot tore a large part of the head off, and we have that. And we have the gun here also. And we also have tested the fact that you could fire, those three shots were fired within 3 seconds.
Were they aiming at the president?
They were aiming directly at the president. There's no question about that.
Far from being bugged by his FBI chief, it was President Johnson who was secretly recording that telephone call. 3 days after taking over at the White House, he ordered his secretary to put a recording device across his line.
This was a very primitive taping system done on something called dictaphone belts. And dictaphone belts were simply small sleeves, small blue and red sleeves, which went around a turntable of a kind. The decision was the president's. When I told him that someone was on the line, his word would be, take this one. And take it meant activate the machine.
This is what the Oval Office looked like when Johnson sat in it. 4,000 hours of calls made here were secretly recorded and locked away for history. The first installment of 350 hours have now been declassified. The tapes provide an extraordinary insight into the way the presidency works and into the complex mind of the man who took over when Kennedy was killed.
I'm pro-Russian. Right when Nixon's running against me. That's all it does.
All the voices you will hear are extracts from these recordings. We have reconstructed some scenes to help illustrate the story of the most turbulent transition between presidents in American history.
Well, it ain't. Don't try to shit me, because I know better.
Hello, I've got some dictation for you on the Kennedy story.
Yeah, where are you, Tom?
I'm in Dallas. Hey, this is Dallas, November 22nd. President John F. Kennedy was shot and killed here today, period. Lyndon B. Johnson was sworn in at 2:39 p.m. Central Standard Time as the 36th President of the United States. Period. Paragraph.
Air Force One, understand. Airborne 1725 Zulu. Do you have an ETA order?
Johnson demanded that he take the presidential oath without delay. The conversation recorded later reveals why. He thought the Kremlin might have ordered the assassination, that other killings might follow, and that the American government must be seen to be still functioning.
And I thought that it was a conspiracy. What raced through my mind was that if they had shot our president driving down there, who would they shoot next? And what was going on in Washington? And when would the missiles be coming?
Aboard Air Force One, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy stayed at the rear of the plane, close to the coffin. Johnson, sitting further forward in the president's seat, made several telephone calls. One was to Rose Kennedy, the dead president's mother.
Break Crown Air Force One, volunteer requesting a patch with Mrs. Rose Kennedy as soon as possible. Go ahead. Miss Kennedy?
Yes, Mr. President.
I wish to God there was something that I could do, and I wanted to tell you that we were grieving with you.
Thank you very much. I know you love Jack and he loves you. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Goodbye. Goodbye.
It was silent. All we could hear were the engines. People were whispering. People were walking and treading very carefully because here were two different sets of people who didn't know each other and who were thrown together under the worst experience, in the worst circumstance you could think of in your life. When it came time for me to type the president's arrival statement, this was almost irreverent. It was such a spiritual place. All of us were close to some sort of connection to any God that we might have had. And to hear
And when would the mystery
was an insult.
This is a sad time for all people. We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help and God's.
I thought the most important thing in the world was to decide who was president of this country at that moment. I was fearful that the communists were trying to take us over.
Johnson's determination to show that he was still in charge caused friction between the personal aides he was bringing in and the existing White House staff. It started early next morning at the doors of the Oval Office.
And at 8:30, L.B.J. came in and said to me, "Miss Lincoln, would you come into the office with me?" I walked in the Oval Office. He said, "I need you more than you need me." He said, could you get all of the Kennedy possessions out of the Oval Office, your office, and the cabinet room by 9 o'clock? I went to Bobby, and Bobby just could not understand it.
I felt resented. We were dealing with a staff which is decimated. There was nobody to tell us, here are the telephones, the restrooms are down the hall, and you get a coffee down there. We were different, and we were in their space. This was their home, their White House. They had worked to get elected there. We did not belong there, and they had lost their best friend. They hurt. Ripe field for disagreement.
In those first few days, Johnson suspected Robert Kennedy of making mischief. Here were two strong-willed, ambitious men, one unable to accept the consequences of his brother's death, the other determined not to allow the Kennedy mystique to undermine his own rightful authority as the new president.
Philosophically, every way, his brother's loss was devastating to him. He was never the same person afterwards. And yet he had to carry on not only his duties as Attorney General of the United States, but his duties as the leader of the Kennedy family, succeeding the leader who had fallen. And that meant that many people were already talking about him running for president. It meant many people were trying to stir animosity against Lyndon Johnson and use him and bring him into it. So, of course, there was a Bobby problem, as Lyndon Johnson called it.
Also, they detested each other, but Johnson needed the younger Kennedy to stay on as Attorney General, at least for now. 3 days into the new presidency, Johnson's recording machine was up and running, and it reveals how Johnson kept Kennedy aboard. He asked Clark Clifford, a man they both could trust, to be an intermediary.
Clark Clifford on 9-2.
Yes, Clark.
Mr. President?
Yes.
I've just finished a 2-hour session with Bobby.
Yeah.
And first I want to say he's going to stay.
Good.
We really had it out, and we covered it all, and I think there's some arguments that he found unanswerable, and I'm just authorized to say now that he's going to stay. He's going to have a talk with you, and I ought to have a talk with you first. And, it's a relationship that I think is exceedingly important.
As Attorney
One that we ought to look at together.
All right.
An even more intriguing call was put through to J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI. The Kennedys had kept Hoover at arm's length. Dangerous as a rattlesnake, he'd once been called. But that wasn't Johnson's style. He wanted to keep Hoover inside the tent, as this creepy little exchange shows.
You're more than the head of the Federal Bureau, as far as I'm concerned. You're my brother and personal friend, and you have been for 25, 30 years. I got more confidence in your judgment than anybody in town. And I certainly appreciate your confidence. Well, thank you. Thank you, Edgar.
What you hear next is part of a personal briefing Hoover gave the president 5 days after the assassination.
We hoped to have this thing wrapped up today, but the bubble top was not up. But the bubble top wasn't worth a damn anyway because it made entirely of plastic. And much to my surprise, the Secret Service do not have any armored cars.
Do you have a bulletproof car?
Well, yes, I do. Yes,
Do you think I ought to have one?
I think you most certainly should have one. Most certainly should. I think you've got to recognize, you've got to really almost be in the capacity of a so-called prisoner.
They went on to talk about Jack Ruby, or Rubenstein, killing Oswald, all because, according to Hoover, the Dallas police were trying to please the television networks by parading Oswald before the cameras.
The chief of police admits that he moved him in the morning as a convenience and at the request of the motion picture people who wanted to have daylight. Now, this fellow Rubenstein is a very shady character. He likes to be in the limelight. He knew all the police. That's how I think he got into police headquarters, and for that reason raised no question. Because they never made any moves as the pictures show, even when they saw him approaching this fellow, and got up right to him and pressed his pistol against Oswald's stomach. Neither of the police officers on either side made any move to push him away or to grab him.
Have you got any relationship between the two yet?
Between Rubenstein?
Yeah.
No, at the present time we have not.
Behind the scenes, even during the funeral, was a dispute about the assassination inquiry. Johnson wanted to leave it to Edgar Hoover and the force in Dallas. Others insisted that only a presidential commission of inquiry would do. When the Congress threatened to hold its own hearings, Johnson gave in, provided he could choose its members. America's Chief Justice, Earl Warren, was persuaded to be chairman. As Warren's deputy, Johnson wanted his oldest friend in the Senate, Richard Russell of Georgia. What you'll now hear is an example of Johnson's strong-arm technique.
Dick,
Yes, Mr. President?
I wanted you to know that I made that announcement.
Well, announcement what?
May I read it to you?
Yes.
The President announced that he is appointing a special commission to study and report upon the assassination of the late President John F. Kennedy. The members of the special commission are, Chief Justice Earl Warren, Chairman. Senator Richard Russell, Georgia.
Well, now, Mr. President, I know I don't have to tell you my devotion to you, but I just can't serve on that commission with the Chief Justice Warren. I don't like that man, and I don't have any confidence in him.
Dick, it's already been announced, and you can serve with anybody for the good of America. Now, the reason I ask Warren is because he's the Chief Justice of this country. The reason I ask you is because you have that same kind of temperament, and you can do anything for your country, and don't go to give me that kind of stuff about you can't serve with anybody. You can do anything. You never turned your country down? Well, this is not me. This is your country. You're my man on that commission, and you're going to do it. And don't tell me what you can do and what you can't, because I can't arrest you, and I'm not going to put the FBI on you, but you're goddamn sure going to serve, I'll tell you that.
I think you did wrong getting Warren. I know damn well you got wrong getting me, but
No.
we'll both do the best we can.
I think that's what you do. That's kind of American, both of you are. Good night.
Good night.
To the new president, every government building in Washington seemed to be swarming with men and women appointed by Kennedy, still grieving for their hero, resenting the usurper from Texas. As vice president, Johnson had felt patronized by Kennedy's inner circle, the Harvards, as he bitterly called them. In a telephone call to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, we get a glimpse of Johnson's conviction that those who loved Kennedy could never be loyal to him.
Well, I think state leaks everything they got. I've got about as much confidence in them as I have in a Soviet spy. They leak everything they get. I'm wondering if our wires are tapped at all. Every time I say something in the State Department, I read about it. And I just, it's getting me frightened to even take a call. I think it's just a sieve over there. This is getting awfully bad, and it's going to hurt me and hurt state, but I'm not going to quit talking to anybody. I'm just going to take you off in the bathroom, because I'm afraid that somebody over there is talking and talking regularly.
Another call made late one night shows Johnson's constant need for reassurance, even comfort. He's talking here to Kay Graham, owner of the Washington Post, a close friend of the Kennedys.
Hello.
Hello, Mr. President.
Hello, my sweetheart. How are you?
Well, I'm fine. Are you?
You know, the only one thing I dislike about this job is that I'm married and I can't ever get to see you. I just hear that sweet voice, and it's always on telephone. And I'd like to break out of here and be like one of these young animals down on my ranch, jump a fence.
What had prompted Johnson's flirtation with one of America's most important publishers was a behind-the-scenes row over his first speech as president to Congress.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
It was his 5th day in power. Johnson had chosen Capitol Hill for his platform because it was the Congress that had brought Kennedy's legislative program to a halt. 93 bills marooned in committees and now waiting for the Johnson treatment to turn them into law.
On the 20th day of January in 1961, John F. Kennedy told his countrymen, "Let us begin." Today, in this moment of new resolve, I would say to all my fellow Americans, let us continue.
The speech was a triumph. Only insiders knew what a nasty backstage squabble had preceded its delivery. Johnson had asked Ted Sorensen, a Kennedy favorite, to write the speech. To Johnson, what Sorensen actually produced was a long eulogy to Kennedy that said nothing of his own intentions as president. Johnson called his old friend Abe Fortas to take charge and discarded 3/4 of Sorensen's draft.
I recall we had one hell of a time because Sorensen guarded his prose with the zeal of a samurai warrior. But I remember riding over to the Capitol. So I know Sorensen was in the car, and in his hands, he was clasped into his bosom, was the 3-ring binder in which was enclosed the speech of the president before that joint session. He made it clear he wasn't going to let anybody, maybe not even the president, look at that speech again until he put it on the rostrum so that nobody could make a substitution.
Johnson wasn't accustomed to insubordination. He wanted to make sure the press had his side of the story, hence the call to Kay Graham.
It's so difficult. It was tragic the other night. I could have just blown everything and fallen on my head. It was such agony that I haven't recovered from it.
I know.
I've got all these temperamental people, and they all go and cry, and they say, well, Abe Fortas put this paragraph in and took my paragraph out. Now, the speech that came in was a great tribute to a great man. But Congress expected a little something else. They wanted to know how I was going to stand on these things, and I had to say so. And I had to say action now. But he did it to me going up to deliver it. We spent the whole time arguing, and I said, well, you've got 80% of your stuff in there.
He was just unforgivable, and yet I think that we all have to just imagine how he feels, and that he's a man who doesn't, instead of crying, he did this really naughty trick. But of being cantankerous and hurt, because he had that peculiar relationship with President Kennedy.
Well, I've done as much as I can with have any pride and self-respect left.
Johnson's call didn't heal any wounds. The ghost of John Kennedy would continue to haunt his presidency.
Mr. Smith, 2191.
Margaret?
Mr. President.
Lyndon Johnson, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Capitol Hill had been the love of Lyndon Johnson's life. Now, in the Oval Office, he was lonely, missing his old companions. But there was always the telephone.
I just wanted to call you and tell you I loved you, and I didn't have anything to talk to you about except I missed seeing you there on that front row.
Well, come on up and see us.
Well, I wish I could, but they won't let me get over there, and they got a big rock wall around me down here, and I'm going to have to get you to crawl under it.
Now, you behave yourself.
I will.
Because that's the most important at the moment. You're doing a wonderful job. We want you to keep on doing it.
I'm going to do the best I can, honey. I'm going to do the best I can. I'm just going to do what I think's best every day, and I appreciate talking to you, and I'll see you soon. Bye, dear.
The telephone became his Excalibur, his great weapon. Because a couple of times I'd say, Mr. President, maybe we ought to have him, some congressman or somebody, come in and talk to you in your local office for a personal visit. And I said, it'll be a very brief visit, believe me, a few minutes. He said, Jack, by the time that somebody comes in here and tells me how smart he is and what he wants and scratches his ass, I've lost 15 to 25 minutes.
Johnson always said that a president has 2 years at the most to impose his will on the Congress. Immediately after Kennedy's death, he had held the country together and earned its respect. Now he wanted action, and that meant rousing the Senate from its habitual lethargy. He called one of the Senate elders, John Stennis of Mississippi.
Senator Stennis on the phone.
John, you try to get those folks up there to go to work. People are laughing at them. The barbers are talking about it. I got a haircut, and the barber said, what in God's world happened to Congress?
Yeah, well,
They paid on an annual basis, and they took off 2 weeks for Thanksgiving. Now they want off 3 weeks for Christmas. Said, I just get off 1 day for each. Get them to work some, John. Tell them you'll stay there at night if they need to. I never saw.
He was a tornado on a leash. He was a human being, a man of great extremes. He could be very, very kind. He could be very, very angry and very, very cruel. He had trouble with his anger. Where do I put this thing? It was almost as if you could see the man with this ball of anger and he didn't know where to put it. And woe to the person who was near.
Well, I've been...
He'd give us $3 billion to it in Congress, and he's a damn liar. And I've got to run the foreign policy of the country.
Then there was the so-called Johnson treatment, the ability to dominate, charm, and shock. For his staff, a sense that they could never be sure what he would say next.
I reached an agreement with McClellan on the transportation bill, and I brought it back to Johnson. I was very happy. I said, Mr. President, I've got an agreement. We got a deal, we got a bill. The President had described the agreement to him. And Johnson said, open your fly. And I kind of laughed. He said, open your fly. He said, there's nothing in there. He said, John McClellan just took that off with a razor so thin you didn't even feel it. He picks up the phone, he calls John McClellan. He says, John, he says, you got Joe Califano's pecker up there, and he said, and I want him to come up there and get it back. We can't agree to a deal like this. We got to have another kind of deal. And I went back up there, and we had another kind of deal that was much more acceptable to Johnson.
He was a man of ferocious energy. He often went to sleep at 2 a.m. and was up by 6, and he demanded the same dedication from everyone around him.
It's a marathon. The days would go from 8 in the morning until sometimes 3 at night. I always teased him, and I said that he cut 2 words out of every dictionary in the White House. The first word was vacation. We never even knew what that meant. And the other was sleep, because we got so little of it. And if we didn't know the definitions, we wouldn't ask for it. One day he couldn't reach me, and he said, where were you? And I didn't know where I was, but I just needed some peace and quiet. I said, I was in the bathroom. The next day there was a phone in the bathroom.
To cope with all the activity he generated, Johnson doubled his staff of female secretaries and made them work in shifts. With that, he put the head of the civil service to work, finding his ideal of a working woman.
I want the 5 smartest, best educated, fastest, prettiest secretaries in Washington.
All right.
And I want to put them right here under my office where I can get them and dictate. I waited an hour and a half this morning and had the goddamn cabinet sitting around waiting to try to get the State of the Union out. And people that can't spell their name operating, and I just don't think a president ought to have to do that.
Absolutely not.
I don't want any old, broken down old maids. I want them from 25.
Ferocious.
I want them that can work Saturday and Sunday.
Right.
I want them that can work at night, not be afraid to go home after the Secret Service takes them out of the gate. I want them to have a college degree if it's at all possible, and be able to keep secrets. And I've got to have some people that I can trust.
One recruit was Johnson's personal choice, a young woman he'd noticed in a government office. Late one night, he asked Jack Valletti to find her home number.
Hello?
Where are you?
I'm at home. Who's this?
This is the president.
Oh.
What are you doing?
Oh, I think someone's playing with me.
No, you're not. I want to talk to you about our work, honey. Where are you, at home?
Oh, yes, I am.
Are you busy?
No, I'm not.
Can you come down here immediately?
Oh, I'd be glad to.
Come down. I've got Jack Valletti here, and we want to talk to you about a little reassignment.
This is Jack Valletti speaking.
With that, he put the head of the civil service to work, finding his ideal of a working woman.
very much. Right?
It's just 10:45 at night, but he says, I want to visit with you. He didn't mean 9 o'clock tomorrow morning or 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. He meant now.
She called me and said that we had to have lunch that day. And she told me what had happened. And she was almost in shock. And she said, what's up? I said, he wants a black secretary. But if I were you, I'd grab it, but I'd be leery and wary because he is a Vesuvius of a man.
So now, the president's visitors to the Oval Office, including all those crusty old senators from America's Deep South, would walk past a black girl on their way to see the chief. But how to make it public? Parade his discovery before the White House press? No, too blatant. Johnson had a better idea.
Now let's all play What's My Line?
And now to meet our first challenger. And we'll let the audience in the theater and the audience at home know exactly what your line is. Miss Whittington, may both men and women enjoy your services?
Yes. Miss Whittington, does your service require any physical dexterity of any kind? Yes.
Well, do you work for a non-profit making organization?
Are you connected with the White House in any way? Yes. Are you a secretary? Yes.
Very good, Doris. Miss Whittington is about as secretary as you can get if you're attached to the White House. Miss Whittington is one of President Johnson's secretaries.
Well, the president has great warmth. He's fair, kind, but at the same time he demands total excellence at all times.
There is no doubt that in those days, black people paid a lot of attention to the proximity of blacks to power. So the fact that he had a black secretary, those of us who were in Washington watched those things and calibrated, and people out in the country cared.
It was a tiny step in an uphill climb toward Johnson's principal goal, to enact a civil rights bill that would guarantee black Americans access to thousands of places that had excluded them for nearly 100 years: shops, hotels, restaurants. It was the bill Kennedy had failed to get through the Congress. Johnson believed that America was ready for change, and that he was the man with the political muscle to force the Congress to give in.
We have talked long enough in this country about
Require any physical dexterity of any kind? Yes.
Well, do you work for a non-profit making organization?
Are you connected with the White House in any way? Yes. Are you a secretary?
and to write it in the books of law.
Johnson craved praise. In the next 2 hours, he made 33 telephone calls asking, "How did I do?" Nearly every call was to someone whose approval he knew he could count on. This one is typical. It's to Adam Clayton Powell, the black congressman from Harlem.
Did I do all right on civil rights? My friend, it was unequivocally the finest that I said it was more than I hoped for. And it was the finest that anyone could say. Forthright, it was really wonderful. You were at your best today. Absolutely superb. I don't know when you got the time to do it, though.
Well, they had 34, you all were gunners. You had 34 applauses in 24 minutes.
I know you have good ghostwriters, but, brother, that was Lyndon Baines Johnson. That wasn't any ghostwriter. That speech was absolutely magnificent.
The new president had a special relationship with the Congress. He sent a small army of aides to Capitol Hill.
I'd tell a senator or a congressman, Mr. Congressman, Senator, the president must have your vote. And I want to tell you that if you give it to him, he will always remember. But if you don't, he'll never forget.
He now made a personal call to Dr. Martin Luther King to say that the civil rights movement had an ally in the Oval Office.
But I won't tell you how grateful I am and how worthy I'm going to try to be of all your hopes.
Well, thank you very much. I'm so happy to hear that. I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate.
Well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help.
Then Johnson telephoned the more radical black leaders, men like James Farmer of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. Farmer had never spoken to a president.
The phone rang, and a southern female voice said, Mr. Farmer? I said, yes. Mr. James Farmer? I said, yes. I said, hold the line for the president. Well, naturally, I started to say, President or what? And Lyndon Johnson's voice came on the telephone. He said, Mr. Farmer, now we are going to have to pick up the ball and...
Not move with that ball, and let's go and go right on through to that goal line, and then not ever... We might get run out of bounds time or two, but keep coming. And
I went down to see him in Washington. And come right in, Mr. Farmer. Sit down in that big chair. That's a Texas-sized chair. And as he was jerking my arm out of the socket, his phone rang. And he answered it. It was some senator returning his call. And he was twisting this caller's arm, trying to get him to commit himself to vote for the Civil Rights Bill.
Now, you're either for civil rights or you're not. You're either the party of Lincoln or you ain't. And that's by God, put up or shut up. And we've been talking about this for 100 years. Looks like it's about time to stop talking. And I just think that we're going to have them out in the streets again if we don't make some little progress.
Got to make it.
He was doing all that he could, and all the while he was throwing a glance at me to make sure that I was listening. Now, when he finished those conversations, I asked him, Mr. President, how did you get to be that way? What happened? I said, I know that your background on civil rights has not been very good. In fact, it's been bad. He said, well, Mr. Farmer, that's a good question, a fair question. And I will answer it by quoting a friend of yours, and you will immediately recognize the quote. Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last.
A quotation, of course, from Martin Luther King. For 30 years, as a congressman and senator, Lyndon Johnson had looked over his shoulder at the conservative voters of Texas. Now he had a wider constituency, America. 6 months later, Martin Luther King was just behind the president as he signed the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, the act that broke apartheid in the southern states of America.
30 days and a few hours ago, John Fitzgerald Kennedy died a martyr's death.
By Christmas of '63, America's 30 days of official mourning for the assassinated president were over. But Kennedy's presence still dominated Washington, and Johnson found his uninhibited Texas style being unkindly compared with the grace and elegance of his predecessor. Sophisticated Washington wags used to joke about L.B.J. padding about the White House at night, turning out the lights. He even abolished the floodlights, giving the place a haunted look. One day, wanting a group photo of his family, he called a still photographer he knew. Again, this is the original sound. We've added the pictures.
Let's send Miss Lyndon Johnson.
Mr. Johnson, yes, sir.
Can I talk to you now without getting in the paper and getting it advertised?
Oh, surely.
Older.
If not, I won't talk to somebody else, but I hope I can. But I don't want it in any of these columns now, and I don't want it to get out.
I give you my solemn word as a gentleman.
All right. Now, I'm a poor man. I don't make much money, but I got a wife and a couple of daughters and 4 or 5 people that run around with me, and I like the way you make them look. This is your country, and I want to see what you want to do about it. Now, how can you come down here and make them look better? I just have to live off of a paycheck, and I'm in debt, but I want to see if you can't come and bring whoever you need, and we'll pay their transportation, but we can't pay you much else.
Mr. Johnson, don't even worry about that.
All right, goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye, sir.
Actually, Johnson was a rich man, but he never paid for the pictures. Johnson was instinctively frugal, even parsimonious. He always had been from his days as a teacher in the small town of Catula on the Mexican border.
This was a man who lived through the Depression. He saw poverty. The Mexican children that he first saw and taught came to school hungry. He knew the value of $1, and he worked hard for the dollar, he thought. One of the more amusing things that he recycled styrofoam cups by washing them. And Mrs. J would be upset if she heard me say that. But he felt a styrofoam cup should not be thrown away. You wash it and use it again.
Attacking poverty was another Kennedy idea, but Kennedy had only observed poverty in middle age while campaigning in West Virginia and put little political effort into the program to eliminate it. Johnson had seen it close up from his youth. His telephone calls to his planners show what a high priority he was willing to give to these social programs, at the expense even of defense.
You go and get me a good, solid program that Harry Byrd will look upon with pleasure, and I'll approve it. You just get me not over 2 pages, short sentences, short paragraphs, and let's have something good for this State of the Union that Galbraith won't be giving us hell and saying that Johnson's not forward-looking. If you talk to ABC, if they ask you to appear lately, you just tell them that we're cutting out archaic, out-of-date installations, teaching boys to fly, and we don't need them flying. We're going to use missiles. Right. We're not going to make more atomic bombs than we need, because that makes Russia make more. And we may lose 300 workers, but we'll put them to work on poverty. And that we're going to have the tightest budget that anybody's had since your knowledge, but it's going to be full for human need.
That Christmas, he invited his chief domestic advisors to join his family in sunny Texas, but they were there to work. What he demanded of them was a plan to lift 20% of Americans out of poverty, 32 million men, women, and children.
And I remember he said, now I want you guys to get in that guest house and close the door, and don't come out until we have a plan to deal with this poverty situation. And it was kind of funny to hear the cows mooing outside our windows and shuffling around.
I would just go verbatim with that. I don't know.
And here we're sitting around a little second-hand kitchen table, scratching out ideas. And we worked several days in there, and we came out with a name, The War on Poverty, and the outlines of the plan.
And this administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America.
He had some fundamental beliefs. He believed that government's role was to help the poor and the most vulnerable among us. Without Lyndon Johnson, you wouldn't have Medicare to provide health care for the elderly. You wouldn't have Medicaid to provide health care for the poor. You wouldn't have this flush of civil rights legislation, which has changed the politics of the United States of America in many, many states. It was an incredible onrush of legislation. It changed this country.
We have a right to expect a job, to provide food for our families, a roof over their head, an opportunity to have our children educated. And with your support and with your help, we will have it in America. Thank you.
His opponents on Capitol Hill could do little to block his domestic policy, but Johnson knew that any hint of liberalism in foreign policy could be fatal.
Have you got the language in front of you? Yes, sir. I got it in front of me. And it oughtn't to be in there, and it's just a damn...
Agency on national in connection with the purchase in the...
That's right.
Johnson is talking here to a congressman from Texas, Albert Thomas, about American grain sales to the Russians. He's upset because Congress is insisting that he take personal responsibility for each individual sale.
Read your language further. And reports each determination.
Why should I want to report to everybody that I screwed a girl? You screwed one last night, but you don't want to report it.
I wish I did.
Well, you know what I'm talking about. That made it come home to you, didn't it?
Well, it ain't gonna.
Well, don't you think I'm a damned idiot now?
No, of course not. But I don't think it's gonna hamstring you a bit on Earth.
It doesn't hamstring me. It just publicizes that I'm pro-Russian right when Nixon's running against me. That's all it does. Right, well, you just don't ever agree that that's a good clause, because you know goddamn well it ain't. Don't try to shit me, because I know better.
Johnson was afraid that Nixon would call him soft on communism, which he wasn't, and ignorant in foreign affairs, which he certainly was.
The world out there beyond Texas and Washington.
His opponents on...
But that world was, as you know, festering, and that was Vietnam, and that was Asia. And he couldn't even pronounce the names of the places over there. He didn't have any idea where they were, didn't have any idea who knew anything about them.
Red terror tactics in South Vietnam hit at the United States Embassy in Saigon. 2 Americans and 11 Vietnamese are dead.
Kennedy had sent 15,000 military advisors to South Vietnam. It was a clear enough commitment. But Johnson worried about where it might lead. On March 2nd, he called the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to read him a top-secret analysis of options. 1, pull out. 2, negotiate a settlement. 3, send in the Marines. Or
4, we continue our present policy of providing training and logistical support for the South Vietnam forces. This policy has not failed, and we're losing what we're doing. We got to decide whether to send them in or whether to come out and let the dominoes fall, and that's where the tough one's going to be, and you do some heavy thinking, as a little Jewish boy said. Yeah. Do some heavy thinking. Let's decide what we do. Yeah. Okay.
what the telephone calls underline is that both Johnson and the tight little circle of top brains he had inherited from Kennedy were out of their depth on Asia.
I just can't believe that we can't take 15,000 advisors and 200,000 people and maintain the status quo for 6 months. I just believe we can do that if we do it right. Now, I don't know enough about it to know, so I don't.
Do you think it's a mistake to explain what I'm saying now about Vietnam and what we're faced with?
Well, I do think, Mr. President, that it'd be wise for you to say as little as possible. The frank answer is we don't know what's going on out there.
Saying as little as possible to the media was one thing. Johnson's problem was how he said it. To get the American people behind him, he had to be good on television, and he wasn't.
Who is the father of us all.
As a political animal, at full velocity, on stream, he was irresistible. One epical flaw. He never mastered television. He treated television in the same way that one picks up a wolf by the ears, very gingerly. And he always thought that whatever he did on television was going to be compared with this enormously charming and fascinating John Kennedy. So he became grandfatherly and presidential and oftentimes boring.
Knowing he had a lot to learn, Johnson asked his wife, Lady Bird, to review his performance. She phoned his office from the residence.
You want to listen for about 1 minute to my critique, or would you rather wait till
Yes,
tonight?
ma'am. I'm willing now.
I thought that you looked strong, firm, and like a reliable guy. Your looks were splendid. The close-ups were much better than the distance ones.
The answer is no to both your questions.
Every now and then you need a good, crisp answer for change of pace, and therefore I was very glad when you answered one man. The answer is no to both of your questions. In general, I'd say it was a good B+. How do you feel about it?
I thought it was much better than last week.
At any rate,